All right, how's it going, guys? All right, so I was really torn today because I don't know if I shared with you, but I'm going to be 40 years old in February, and I've had so much fun teaching this class for the past 6 years that I got lost in all the details for a while, and I just had fun focusing on each topic. And I used to teach this class very differently. I used to approach it from there's a basic number of concepts and ideas and skills that I want everyone to have. So it was a lot more exam-based, quiz-based, and that kind of thing. But this time is different. Now that I have all this experience and I've mastered the content, it's like I've had a gestalt shift in what I really think is important. And I also recognize that, I'm older and a lot of you are, in your 20s or younger or somewhere around there. And so one of the things I'm struggling with this course is, in addition to my fluency with the material, which gives me a kind of freedom and ease and spontaneity, so that's changed my presentation style. It has also challenged me in terms of, to the extent that we said that the mind, the mind is an activity, not a thing. So as I look back at my life, I see this thing called life, and I have the deep need to kind of reach out to you and not let you go through life without a roadmap. And I think philosophy can really give you a really nice roadmap, We focused on all these intellectual and academic stuff, but I want to remind you that if you look at the history of the world, some of the best men, like some of the greatest men, some of the noblest men, some of the best characters have been philosophers. And studying their lives is very fruitful, just like studying the life of Martin Luther King or Robert Kennedy or JFK, So those inspirational things I was doing at the beginning of class, that's what that was an attempt to do. It was an attempt to say, look, before we're philosophers, we're human beings, and philosophy should serve life. It shouldn't serve itself, and it shouldn't serve peer-reviewed journals that are only read by other scholars. But I don't know, man. I'll try to fit in the inspirational stuff somehow, or we can talk about that stuff in office hours too. But the content that we have to get through is also very rich, and that's very important too. So from an ethical point of view, I feel like I have to do my duty and just kind of follow the syllabus as much as possible. And an hour and 15 minutes just goes by so quickly. So I'll try and fit it in somehow. I don't know. But I just wanted to share that with you because the inspirational stuff I think is more important than the other stuff we're doing. But at the same time, this is a course on academic and academic philosophy. So I don't know. Maybe I'll fit it in somehow. But like Hume, which is what we're going to cover today, there's just so much to say about it, and I'd rather spend all my energy saying it really, really well so it sinks in. And I'm going to need all this time to do that. So I don't know when we'll resume the inspirational stuff, all the Goodwill Hunting and the Shawshank Redemption type stuff. I think that stuff is supremely important, just like the Quran, the Bible, and the Hindu scriptures are, but I can't preach in class. It's not fair. So, without further ado, We finished off last time with something wonderful. We did a kind of summary and consummation of one of the most interesting periods in the history of the world and in the history of philosophy, which is called the early modern period. And it's the early modern period that coincides with one of the best, most brilliant movements, cultural movements in the history of Europe, known as the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment stood for certain ideals, certain values, things like autonomy. When I use the word autonomy, what comes to mind? Automation. Yes, automation. But in fact, yeah, the word auto is in both. So, okay, what does automation and autonomy have in common? If you think about it, yeah, exactly. An automaton, a machine, if it's really sophisticated, it runs by itself. And a person who's autonomous, auto, self-running, and then nomos comes from the Greek law. So self-governing, giving yourself laws, right? So the Enlightenment was this wonderful period, guys. So rich. In fact, I was reading it just before class so I could get inspired to teach this properly. This is the portable, I think this is a penguin, the Viking portable library. It's a penguin, and it's called the Portable Enlightenment Reader. So it's just, some excerpts from some of the best passages from the Enlightenment. And it's just so rich, it blows my mind, right? Like, this is a period when people like Voltaire, people like Diderot, people like Locke, people like Thomas Jefferson. Guys, this is such a rich period. It's a period when people began to take control of the best that culture has to offer, meaning reason, meaning nobility, meaning high-mindedness. They took all of that, and then they created a new world. Christopher Columbus, some people say, discovered the new world, but our founding fathers, people like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, these people, Benjamin Franklin, these people were extremely noble. I don't think we can ever do them justice. They wanted a world where people were free. The values they celebrated were things like freedom, things like the intellectual and the rational life, and this thing called autonomy, self-rule. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful period. I love the Renaissance too, but the Renaissance was more backward-looking, and the Enlightenment is more forward-looking. Remember, there was this period called the medieval period in which religion absorbed all culture. All paintings were done for God. All philosophy is done for God. You get the picture? Man is kind of neglected. So what happens in the Renaissance is that as we emerge out of the dark ages, so to speak, people look back and they're like, man, the ancient world, the Greco-Roman world was beautiful. And humanity is beautiful, and there are beautiful specimens of intellect and art and symmetry and harmony. So when Petrarch or Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo looks back to the period right before it, he calls it the Dark Ages because compared to Cicero and Seneca and Marcus Aurelius and Virgil and Ovid, it looks like it was dark. Like, where was the intellectual and artistic activity? Everything is dedicated to God. So the Renaissance is extremely important cultural movement, but it's more backward looking. It's saying, look, let's look back to find ways to study this beautiful thing called the human being. God is great. They're not atheists, but they're saying, hey, we human beings, we're not just wretched sinners. We're also beautiful. Our human anatomy is beautiful. Our intellect is beautiful. So the Renaissance is a kind of celebration of humanism, right? It's a beautiful thing to be a human. We're not just rejects who have original sin because we rebelled against God. So that's beautiful. But the Enlightenment is also on its own extremely beautiful because the Enlightenment takes it a step further. And in addition to celebrating humanity, the Enlightenment wants to liberate humanity. And now it gets very practical. When I talk about liberation, I'm talking about liberation from the institution of the church, and liberation from oppressive governments, and liberation from ignorance, and liberation from savagery and barbarism. This is now taking on the process of civilization and using things like industrialism and the commercial world, using those forces to civilize the entire world. Because a lot of things are going on at the same time. There's the Industrial Revolution, there's the rise of the commercial classes, what Marx would call the bourgeoisie. And then there's all this other stuff going on, like discovery of the entire globe, Magellan, Vasco da Gama, Columbus. And then you've also got, of course, this other activity called colonialism and imperialism. So humanity is becoming more connected and more united, and literacy rates are shooting through the roof. Remember, most universities were founded by clergy, by priests, because they were places where you trained ministers to read sacred texts and become preachers. But over time, as these emerging classes rise and enter commerce and get educated, we got more lawyers, more doctors, more businessmen. Those middle classes eventually become politically powerful, and they begin to pay taxes and demand representation in governments. And so the old government, the old Europe begins to shake. The aristocrats begin to lose power. And that reaches its climax in the French Revolution, and to a certain extent in the American Revolution too. So the Enlightenment period is a lot more dramatic than the Renaissance. In the Renaissance, they're celebrating humanity, but not in a revolutionary way, just in a backwards-looking way. But people like Voltaire and Diderot, they are destroying the aristocrats' credibility using their new publications. And they're doing it in the mid-18th century. And it's no surprise that many people attribute what happens at the end of the 18th century to Voltaire and Rousseau, because they write furiously about how we are all entitled to liberty, we're all entitled to equality. And sure enough, right after the American Revolution, the French supported us in liberating us from the British. And when they went back home, they had a revolution of their own. So these ideas of liberty and equality were infectious, and old Europe lost its last aristocrats. They had lost them in England, starting with the Magna Carta. They had lost them in Germany. They had lost them in Spain. They had lost them everywhere except France. So with the exception of Russia, all the aristocracies have crumbled. And it's in that environment that we were telling now this specific history of philosophy. People like Locke. I only talked about Locke from the perspective of mind and things like that, but I gotta share with you, again, in terms of nobility, Locke is like, Thomas Jefferson was in love with Locke. It's from Locke that we get principles of toleration, right? Someone who says, look, when we talk about these things like gods and souls and all that, we barely know what we're talking about. So let's be patient with one another. How are you going to kill someone for disagreeing with you about something that you even don't know? Do you get the idea? Protestants and Catholics killing each other over stuff that's obscure. No one really knows what's going on. And so Locke writes about toleration. Locke writes about how we should have branches of government. Locke and Montesquieu say we should have a judiciary and an executive and a legislative branch so that they can oppose each other and balance each other's power. These are civilized notions that came from a philosopher. And that's what I'm telling you. I don't want to distract you with all the intellectual stuff and miss the elephant in the room, that Locke is more than just a genius. He's a great man, a civilized man. And Thomas Jefferson was studying him. Ben Franklin John Adams, these people were studying Locke. It's a philosopher who in part gave birth to our new world. Yes, Columbus discovered it geographically, but in terms of the architecture of our government and our principles of liberty and equality, there's a philosopher behind that. And it's more important that I tell you that than you get too lost in the details. You see why I'm saying that? Okay. All right. So we have something to cover, guys. We were looking at two different schools of thought, empiricism and rationalism. So we've got empiricism and we've got rationalism, and they're on a collision course. Rationalism goes all the way back to Parmenides, like we talked last time. And then it gets accelerated by Socrates. Socrates invents a methodology. He's giving us human beings a kind of technology to use, right? The Socratic method, the scientific method. The importance, the key part of that is defining things. Yes, you use words all the time. And yes, sometimes you can give good examples of what you mean, but you really want to know what you mean by a word. It's not enough to use it in a common way, and it's not enough even to give good examples. You've got to define it. That is the golden standard that Socrates invented. Can you define what you're talking about? You're talking about God. Can you define that? You're talking about the soul. Can you define that? You're talking about matter. Can you define that? You're talking about virtue. Can you define it? You know what you're talking about if you can't even define the essence of what you're talking about or the necessary and sufficient conditions that have to be met for that thing to be the thing that it is. Now, Socrates did not answer any questions, but he gave us a noble burden. You understand what I mean? He ennobled us not by liberating us from a burden, but by giving us a burden and civilizing us. Before we open our mouths, we've got to think, what do I really mean by what I say? You see what I'm saying? All right. So fast forward to Descartes. Descartes got this self-reliance. He's meditating, he's withdrawing, and he's going to rely on his mind, his intellect, his cognitive faculties to discover deep and important truths about the entire universe. Now, remember, he's not observing the world. He's relying on concepts. So what is he doing? He's engaging in an activity. The activity he's engaging in, we call it reasoning. He's reasoning about the world. He can't rely on his senses, so he's not observing the world, but he's defining things properly. And then he's doing deductive reasoning. And then he's hoping to figure out things about the world by reasoning about it. And he thinks he's made success, progress. And then that gets accentuated. His agenda gets taken up by Spinoza. And oh my God, Spinoza is just like, takes it to another level. Spinoza's almost like Euclid. He's making axioms and adjusting things very properly, such that if you just have a set of first principles or definitions and you get them just right, then automatically that foundation does all the heavy lifting for you. And it's like a technology, it's like a machine. You adjust it properly. It's like programming a computer or whatever. You adjust everything properly and then you let it go and it does its thing. And there you have a skyscraper, a huge system, monument that explains all reality using concepts. And then finally with Leibniz, you get something similar, but Leibniz takes it to a whole new level because Leibniz rationalizes every single aspect of the universe. Again, there is a very specific reason why your heartbeat at this moment is exactly what it is and not something else. There's a very exact reason why you have the number of hairs on your head that you have now and not some other number. You see what I'm saying? Like for him, the world is full of significance, but it's a metaphysical significance. We can't understand it because we're not God. But if we were God, we would see the world full of life and soul and full of design and reason. You see what I'm saying? Now, Leibniz is a hyper-rationalist, right? He's so rationalist that not only is the world perfect, but if we were God, we would see in the world our reflected glory in every single aspect that we looked at it. So, of course, Leibniz can't articulate all of that, but I'm summarizing for you how he thinks, the mentality. And that's the mentality of the rationalists. Now, let's go back to our famous Locke, right? So last time we talked about Locke, I didn't talk about his treatises on government, his letters on toleration. I left that out. What we're focusing on is this thing called the mind. Locke says, look, this metaphysics stuff is kind of fishy. How can you define something into existence? You know, if you adjust definitions properly, you conclude that God exists, or you're concluding that the soul exists. He's a bit skeptical. So he's inclined to say, hey, wait a minute. Let's study what the mind is working with. Let's look at its faculties, its powers, what the resources are that it's working with. And let's figure out, starting with that, let's figure out what are the kinds of things that the mind can know, and then what are the things that it just can't know. And that's a healthy reinvigoration. Do you see that? That's a nice, refreshing trend, a new trend in philosophy. Let's not go on and on and on about proving the Holy Trinity and the Incarnation and all sorts of things that how would you prove that? Let's now start from us. Let's be like Descartes, but instead of doing what Descartes did and looking for internal ideas that you can kind of define and demonstrate things with, let's start with Descartes. Let's look inward, but let's see how the mind actually works. What are the faculties it's using? And then what are the scope and the limits of what we can know? And that revolutionizes philosophy, because that's the birth of empiricism. Empiricism is very different from rationalism. Empiricism says this thing called the mind is not primarily concerned with reasoning or with manipulating concepts. In fact, it doesn't really deal in concepts primarily. There's something it deals with way before it hits any concept or any sort of logical technology for figuring things out. And that thing that it deals with before it gets to the concepts and the symbols that concepts use, that thing is perceptions. The mind is active. It's engaged in an activity. And this is what Descartes also saw, but Descartes didn't really develop this idea fully. Locke is insisting. He says, no. If we look in the mind, it's full of only one kind of thing, and it's not concepts. It's not definitional abstractions. There are no bachelors in the mind. No one has ever seen a bachelor. You can't perceive a bachelor. You can define it, but you can't perceive a bachelor. You just look around you right now, you cannot see a bachelor. A bachelor is a second order or a higher order thing. What you actually see is ideas. That's what you see. Do you guys follow what I'm saying? You perceive, you are engaged constantly in the activity of perception. That's what you actually are doing right now, and that's the only thing you really, really do. Now, to perceive something is just to perceive an idea. They're the same thing. A perception and an idea are not two different things, they're the same thing. An idea is a state of mind or a mental state, and a perception is a state of mind or a mental state. So if you perceive some hatred in you, or some envy, or some love, or some faith, or you perceive cold, or hot, or warm, or hope, or ambition, all those perceptions, those are also ideas. They're the same thing. And Locke is saying that's the stuff the mind is made of, and that's the kind of activity the mind engages in when it's actually acquiring knowledge. Now, again, he's against Descartes because Descartes believes that our soul spontaneously, innately has ideas. Our ideas just pop up in the soul. But as an empiricist, Locke wants to define this thing called experience. An empiricist says ideas don't just pop up in the soul or the mind spontaneously. Every idea in the mind came from somewhere. and it came from some impression made on the senses. So with that setup, that the mind deals mainly in ideas, and those ideas come from external sources, now we have a revolution in philosophy, and we're on a collision course. Do you see that collision course? We got the empiricists, no, you got the rationalists who are using sophisticated conceptual technology to figure out all sorts of stuff about the world without even observing it. And then you got this other group, the empiricists, who are just saying, no, technology is misleading and not very helpful. Let's get back to basics and let's be humble. We probably don't know that much because we're not working with that much. And that's the collision course. So we got Leibniz on the far right of the rationalists, making amazing claims that no one believes, the best of all possible worlds. The world is full of soul and vitality and life and all this. And then on the other hand, you got someone like Locke, who's just like, I want to state things as clearly and humbly as possible. In fact, I'm going to understate things, because right now, things in philosophy are kind of crazy, like we're hallucinating here, let's back up. And then along comes Berkeley, and he just says, look, Locke is absolutely right, but he didn't go far enough. Locke would say, as I look at this room right now, the physical objects that I see are collections of complex collections of ideas, but the ones I see are technically what he calls secondary ideas. He still reserves some metaphysics, right? Because he still says there's this appearance, but then there's some reality that's not shown behind the appearance. So the actual matter and substance that the chair is made of, that I don't see. There's all sorts of qualities that are primary qualities that stick into the chair and that I don't see through my senses. So that's some metaphysical baggage that's left. But Berkeley cleans that up and says, to be is to be perceived. If you don't perceive it, it doesn't exist. Now that's empiricism taken to the maximum, right? Imagine that. If you do not perceive it, it does not exist. So if I turn my head, according to him, if I were the only person in the world and I turn my back on you, then you do not exist. You just dropped out of existence temporarily. And then if I come back and look at you, now you're back in existence. Now, of course, he saw that was a problem, right? So he said, yeah, if we were just human beings, then what we call the world or the universe would be very unstable, popping in and out of existence when we perceive. But he said there's a very special mind that is always perceiving everything all the time, and that gives it its stability. You guys know exactly which mind that is, right? That's God. So that's one of his arguments for God. All right, guys. I'm doing all of this to lead up to Hume, because Hume is a revolutionary. Hume builds on Berkeley and then refines him, and he takes the entire tradition of empiricism and makes it self-consistent. And Hume is like Solomon. Not Solomon, one of the judges. What's his name? The one who destroys the temple and has it fall on him. How could I forget his name? Delilah. He was dating Delilah. I have a mind blank right now. I know my Bible pretty well, and I was talking to my mom about this the other day. We actually read a portion of Judges together. Oh, Samson. Samson in the Bible, the way he dies is that they forgot that his hair gives him his power. So Delilah cut his hair, he lost his power, they captured him and took him to the temple, and they made fun of him, and they really made revenge on him for all of his power before. But they forgot that over time his hair had been growing, so he got back his power. I think they blinded him though. They took out his eyes. But I don't know whether it's the Lord who inspired him or something, but at some point he started shaking. He was tied between two columns, and at some point he started shaking the columns because it was so powerful. It's like Hercules, basically. And he had the whole palace or temple, I can't remember what it was, but it all caved in on him. And he was a hero, he died, but he also killed all of the enemies of the Jewish people, the Hebrews. And that's kind of what Hume does, because I said that empiricism and rationalism are on a collision course, and that's true. They're about to hit ahead with Hume. But the funny thing is, he's so precise and he's so, he makes empiricism so self-consistent that not only does he challenge and arguably destroy rationalism, but he's so self-consistent that he also says empiricism also won't work. So that's him destroying the temple and falling it on himself. I mean, what I'm about to tell you is devastating not only for philosophy, but also for science, and it's devastating not only for rationalism, it's also devastating for all the empiricists that come before. So now let's get into Locke. We're going to get into a very special problem that Locke studied. So guys, Locke picked just the right problem. And he picked something that was so interesting. He picked something in common language that we use all the time. And then he picked something that we use in philosophy and science. And he really did a thorough investigation of our use of these words I'm about to tell you. And what he discovered was that we have a burden there that we could never meet. And we can't meet it as rationalists, and we also can't meet it as empiricists. So from the perspective of the next great philosopher after Hume, which is Kant, this is like the end of metaphysics, like it's the end of philosophy. And one thing Kant saw himself as doing was kind of rescuing philosophy in a certain way, as well as honoring Hume by putting philosophy to sleep in a certain way. So he's putting to sleep a certain kind of philosophy, and he's also rescuing philosophy in a certain way. And this is the story I want to get into. It's really interesting stuff. So what's happening, guys, is that Hume, like I said before, he was a great guy, great guy. Very refined. You've got two types of philosophers, basically. You got the ones who are very refined, like Spinoza, but they choose to withdraw from the world to focus only on their philosophy. And then you got people like Hume and Leibniz, who also don't become academics, they're amateurs, but they refuse to become professors for the opposite reason from Spinoza. It's because they love the world. They want to be involved with the world. They feel like being involved with the world refines them and civilizes them. So Hume, during his time, was much more famous as a historian than he was as a philosopher. He wrote a history of England, or the history of Britain, I can't remember. But that thing was so successful that he wasn't known as a philosopher, he was known as a historian. And his legacy for a while was David Hume, the historian. But then as philosophers understood his influence through Kant and others, his reputation grew in the philosophical community, and now he's at the top. He's like, if you understand what he did, I mean, the history is great, but oh my God, what he did in philosophy is just beyond belief. And Kant said that he had been addicted to Leibniz. He had been addicted to Leibniz for so long that when he actually read some of Hume's work, he said this, and I quote, he said, "Hume awoke me from my dogmatic slumber." Like Hume, like when he read Hume, he felt like he had been sleeping this whole time because he had been just listening to rationalists like Leibniz. And Hume woke him up from that sleep and gave him a burden. And that burden is what he struggles to bear in his new philosophy. So we'll get to that. So, guys, what we're talking about is causation. Hume looked at something that human beings do. They talk about one thing causing another. And we do this at a common level, right? not just philosophers. We say poverty has caused an increase in crime, right? We say that all the time. We say that the fire caused the water to boil. We say that gravity is keeping all the planets in orbit. You know what I mean? We just throw that word out there. But Hume criticizes our sloth. We're using it a bit lazily, a bit sloppily. And now he really puts us to the fire and says, what do you mean by one thing causing another? And what he discovers is that there's a whole bunch of metaphysical assumptions and baggage there that we could never justify. And that causes a revolution in philosophy. Okay, let's get into it. So I'm going to go through this document that I prepared. I think it's only one page. All right. So I call it Studies in Epistemology because, guys, what's happening in empiricism, like I said, starting with Locke, people are tired of all this, scholasticism in the medieval period, and then, what happens with rationalism, people defining God into existence, people proving that this is the best of all possible worlds. They're like, how could you possibly do such a thing? So instead, they're looking at the resources that we're working with, and they're starting to ask questions like, well, what do we know and how do we know it? But remember, the study of knowledge is no longer metaphysics. That orientation towards studying knowledge, when knowledge becomes a big burden, that's not epistemology. You see what I'm saying? Yeah. Metaphysics is the study of reality. Epistemology is the study of under what conditions are our beliefs justified. You see what I'm saying? And that's the orientation that empiricism is taking us through. So I want us to really, really look at what Hume is saying and how he wants to wake us up, make us woke. This is woke philosophy now. He wants us to be woke and start experiencing the burdens that come with these kinds of claims. He thinks that there's a huge burden that comes with claiming one thing causes another. And he's about to wake us up. So let's go. So this is a studies in epistemology because he's really asking us, how would you ever know that one thing causes another? Let's not talk about metaphysics. Let's not talk about what a cause is, or what an effect is, or how they're linked, how one thing is linked to another. Let's not even talk about that. He's going to ask, how do you know one thing causes another? How? How do you know? All right. This is the topic. This is the title I'm giving you. Causes as conditions of effects. So Hume is saying, look, let's start with how we talk, right? When we say one thing is a cause of another, at the most abstract level, in general, what are we trying to say? If we say that if you're playing pool, one ball will only move if it's hit by another ball, then what you're technically saying in rigorous philosophical language is you're saying that the second ball's movement only occurs under certain necessary conditions. Do you see that? What you're saying is, in order for this second ball to move, a certain condition has to be met, and that is it needs to be hit by an external force. Newton gave us the mathematical understanding of that, but even before F equals ma and inertia and all that, we had a common sense, intuitive understanding of that. Guys, Leibniz was onto something. We live in a world where things don't just happen, right? You don't walk out of a room and then come back in and the lights are off and you're like, oh yeah, that's normal, the lights just go off. We live in a world where we believe if something happens, then there was a reason why it happened. And so Leibniz took it to another whole level, but his intuitions are right. As rational creatures, we try to make sense of things. So we assume that whenever something happens, whenever there's a change in the world, there's a reason for the change. Now with Leibniz, it's even more than that. Not just changes in the world. If something is the way it is, then there's a reason why it is just the way it is, even if it's at rest and it's not moving. So Leibniz could look at this chair and fall in love with God because he's going to see God's glory all over this chair, because every single part of this chair is going to have a deep, significant reason why it is the way it is for Leibniz, okay? So Leibniz is crazy. Let's put him aside. Let's go back to Hume. So Hume is saying, look, when you say that one thing caused another, what you're saying is that the cause is a kind of condition for the effect. You see what I'm saying? You don't just have effects happening. Effects don't just happen. Our commitment to causation or causality or cause and effect is a commitment to making sense of the world. And we make sense of the world by rationally putting on an assumption. We assume that when things change, there must be a condition that's met for them to change. You see that? Is everyone following me? Okay. Now, let's read through this. So, causes as conditions of effects. That's the general language. I think we all understand each other, but I want to tweak it just a little bit. It's not just a condition of effect, but since we say every time I take oxygen and wood and I light a flame properly, it burns. So every time there's combustion, there's oxygen involved and something that's burning, right? Now, the thing is, not only do you have conditions for movements and conditions for chemical reactions, but the interesting thing is we have repetition. Once you have the same conditions met, then you have the exact same effect. You see what I'm saying? We live in a very regular world. At standard temperature and pressure, if you do an experiment under the same conditions under which it was first discovered, we live in a world where things are very regular. So you get the exact same effect for the exact same cause if it's done under the exact same conditions. You see what I'm saying? Now this opens up a whole can of worms, right? Because this is no longer just one condition being met for the effect to happen. That consistency begins to suggest something even more profound. It's not just a condition that's met for there to be an effect. It's now what we would call something like a necessary condition. You see what I'm saying? When we use the word necessity, when we call it a necessary condition, now we're saying this. Not only is there a condition that's met whenever there's an effect, but the effect would not happen if this condition were not met. You see what I'm saying? So it cannot be otherwise than that. This is a necessary condition. Necessary means cannot be others. Cannot be other than what it is. It has to be that way. And this, I want you to focus, guys. This is the burden that neither the rationalist nor the empiricist can meet. Why? Let's do some deep thinking. I want to see if we can figure this out together. Why can neither the rationalist nor the empiricist meet this burden of showing not only that there's a condition for every effect that happens in the world, but that this condition is a necessary condition? In other words, causes are necessary conditions of effects. Why is that a burden that neither the rationalist nor the empiricist can meet? And think back to what I told you. Concepts are definitional abstractions, and ideas are perceptions, psychological perceptions. Yes, Dante. Sorry, what? Between concepts and ideas? Yes, that's right. You're going in the right direction. You see, guys, on the side of the rationalists, we have these things called concepts, right? Now, if you define something properly, then you've got this thing called necessity, right? Think about this. If I say a bachelor is an unmarried male, being single and male is not just a condition that has to be met for you to be a bachelor, it's also a necessary condition. Do you see that? In other words, if you are not single and male, you cannot be bachelor. You see that? Okay, so that's on the rationalist side. So on the rationalist side, it looks like they can demonstrate certain things to be necessary. But look at the kind of things that they can define to be necessary. It's things that are trivially true. You see what I'm saying? Yeah, 2 + 2 = 4. We got necessity. Bachelor is unmarried male. We got necessity. Yeah, a triangle has 3 sides. We got necessity. You see that you have the necessity, but okay, it's not very interesting. You see what I'm saying? Yeah, you got the necessity, but you're not telling us anything interesting about ourselves or the world or anything. All you're doing is you're taking our conventions and you're using conventional language in a conventional way to define a bunch of stuff that we already know. That's why it's trivial, it's petty. Okay, now let's look at the empiricist side. On the empiricist side, I said there were 2 things that Locke committed us to. One, the only thing we know are ideas that we perceive. And 2, these ideas always come from the external world. Now, this is a problem because on the rationalist side, we get the necessity, right? We don't need to observe the world. Concepts can give us necessity independent of observing the world. But let's look at the empiricist side. Every idea in the mind must have come from outside. But here's the problem, guys. Necessity is not the type of thing you can perceive. And this is the burden, and it's a fatal burden. Even though Kant tried to rescue metaphysics, he had to hand it to Hume that there was an elephant in the room all the time, and no one saw it but Hume. Guys, this is a problem. Causes, we somehow, in our minds, we link them to effects, okay? Somehow. And in our experience, we experience the world as if causes are linked or associated with effects. So there's nothing wrong with the way we perceive the world. There's nothing wrong with the way we perceive the world, right? There's nothing wrong with the way we perceive the world. Our experiences show us a world like Heraclitus saw. On the one hand, partially, we see permanent things, but we also see some flow, some change. We see movement, and we also see things like reactions. So there's flux and there's also stability. But here's the problem. The problem is that we speak, especially in philosophy. Now, when we graduate from regular language and we get into philosophy and science, we speak as if we had the authority or the entitlement to actually link causes and effects in a necessary way, as if we could back that up. But like I said, yes, on the rationalist side, you can get necessity. Because definitions, if you've got a true definition, then there's necessity there. But it's trivial because of the kinds of things you're defining. Definitions are cheap. On the other hand, with the empiricists, you got this activity, this psychological activity called perception. And the empiricists are committed to the idea that anything you perceive in your mind must have come from outside of the world. But there's no point at which you actually experience or encounter necessity. You might see one pool ball and another pool ball, and you might actually see them engage in something like contact or impact. There's an impulse as one is racing towards the other. But here Hume is very delicate, very refined in his use of language. He says, what you see there, technically, what you see there is not necessity. You never see necessity. What you see is what he calls constant conjunction. That is, what is a conjunction? The word and is a conjunction, right? So when two things are conjoined, when there's a conjunction between two things, that means that they always go together. You see that? In your experience, they go together. I like burgers and fries. I always get my burgers with fries. I like burgers and fries, so they go together, right? Two different ideas. Do you see that? The two different ideas, but they occur in your experience together. Conjoined, conjunction, right? But he's being very precise, very surgical with his language, because he wants to show us the burden. He's saying, what you experience is a kind of correlation, or two things that just go together. And what happens is psychologically, if they go together regular enough, you start assuming that there's some sort of metaphysical connection between them. But that's a habit of your mind. That is not something you're justified in asserting, and it's definitely not something you can prove in an argument, and there's no experiment you could ever do to show it either. Do you begin to see now why Hume is so important? This is what woke Kant up, because Kant was studying Leibniz, and remember Leibniz has got this parallelism and pre-established harmony, and God just set everything synchronizing. That's metaphysics 101, right? That's the height of metaphysics, right? And then Hume is just saying, look, bro, I don't think you understand what's going on. In metaphysics, you are somehow trying to define things and put necessity into the world, but you are grandfathering it in. You're not observing it, but you're using habits of mind, and you're using your habits of your mind that you use to make sense of the world, but you're not entitled to use your own sloth or your own habits and treat them as if they're objective laws in the world. You see what I'm saying? And that's what he's criticizing. So I have a bit of language here. Now that we've talked about that, if we go through this language, I think it'll make a lot more sense. Causes as conditions of effects. First of all, are causes sufficient conditions of effects? So if you have one thing that typically goes together with another, under what conditions is just the occurrence of the cause sufficient or enough to cause the effect? Okay, maybe sometimes that happens. Maybe, if you have oxygen, I don't know, vinegar and baking soda, right? Let's keep it simple. Have you guys ever experimented with vinegar and baking soda? This is classic chemistry. If you're a kid and you like bubbling stuff, you just want to make some bubbles happen, then you get some baking soda and some vinegar and you mix them. And you'll get a whole bunch of, and it's totally not toxic. I think, what is it? Baking soda and what is vinegar, like acetic acid or something? Yeah, anyway, you're releasing something like CO2 and H2O. Now, every time you do that experiment under the right conditions, room temperature, blah, 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 it happens, right? So you could say there's a sufficient condition. In other words, if these conditions are met, they are sufficient to produce this effect. You see what I'm saying? We're not going to solve any of this. I'm just walking you through it so you can get into Hume's mindset. Hume is a surgeon, and he's separating what needs to be separated, and he's arranging it all distinctly and clearly. And as we get into his mentality, we'll begin to see that, we've been making assumptions where there were burdens. You see what I'm saying? All right, so we're claiming that some things called causes are sufficient conditions of these other things called effects. Hume is going to say they go together, I agree. But how would you show sufficiency? Do you ever see sufficiency? Is there an idea out there in the world that corresponds to our concept of sufficiency? He's going to say we're confusing concepts and ideas. Necessity is a concept, no doubt. We can even define necessity, but can you see it? And if you're defining it, but you're not seeing it, that is metaphysics and that is bad philosophy. And now we're heading towards the modern world, guys, because in the modern world, science has won. People are impatient with metaphysics. Part of it came from Hume, part of it came from Kant, part of it came from the Vienna Circle and the logical positivists, people like Karl Popper who were associated with the Vienna Circle, Wittgenstein. As we emerge into the new world, people are impatient with magic tricks and miracles and all this new age stuff. All of that is the kind of stuff where people say, you know, I can just intuit it, I can feel it, right? But you're saying you have an idea of something that no one else can see, whether it's psychic, being a psychic, telekinesis, making something move. You got all sorts of spirits and dwarves and goblins, demons, right? In the modern world, there's a huge burden that still has to be met whenever you make a claim. Our default is Cartesian. Our default is to be like Descartes and doubt everything. Okay? So, can you ever show sufficiency? Are causes sufficient conditions of effects, and how would you know? Are causes necessary conditions of effects? How would you show? How would you show that? Have you ever seen necessity? Have you ever seen sufficiency? Are causes necessary and sufficient conditions of effects? That's an even bigger burden. Now that's two things. You gotta see necessity and sufficiency. How would you ever see that? How would we know any of this? Now this is pure epistemology. And the burden cannot be met by the rationalists because they sit in their rooms and meditate and derive all sorts of claims about the external world without even observing it. That's why to a chemist, a philosopher is useless. You see that? I'm out here discovering boron, beryllium, neon, argon. What have you done? Unless you redefine philosophy, right? If you redefine philosophy and the scientific revolution was actually just a certain kind of philosophy, okay, you can get away with that. Isaac Newton thought of himself as a philosopher. He did, a kind of philosopher, a natural philosopher. That was the name for science before it became revolutionized by universities in the 19th century. Okay? And here, it just gets crazier and crazier. And just what are conditions? What in the world is a condition? If you say that one thing is a condition for another thing, let's get really technical. What does that even mean? Hume doesn't use the word condition. I'm doing an exposition of his work so I can make it intelligible to you, but he doesn't use the word condition. I put that there, but I think it makes sense. If you're saying one thing has a condition to be met for another thing to happen, that's what you're saying when you say one thing causes another, right? Or at least rigorously. If you use language technically and rigorously, that's what you're implying. Now, I don't know. I mean, he doesn't use the word condition. I'm using the word condition, and I'm saying there's a burden there. First of all, can we define what a condition is? And it gets tricky, guys. Because remember we've talked about subjectivity and objectivity? There's conditionality there too. To say to someone, look, don't tell me that Britney Spears is better than Madonna. If you just say that's your subjective opinion, what you're saying is every time you make that statement, there's a certain condition that occurs. And what is that condition? It's the condition of subjectivity. You are the one who sees that truth. You are the one who looks at the world that way. You see that? That's a condition. On the other hand, if objectivity were true, and someone were to say murder is wrong, and it's objectively wrong, there's conditionality there too, but it's a weird conditionality. It's saying, this is a truth that because it's objective, it means that it has no conditions. It's unconditionally true. You see that? That's what objectivity technically means. It means that when I say murder is wrong, I don't have to be attached to it as a condition. No matter who commits the murder, from any perspective, it is always wrong. At any time, at any place. You got what I'm saying? It's above any conditions. It's not only now when it's wrong. That's not a condition. It doesn't have to be now. It doesn't have to be in America. That's another condition. No. When you say something is objectively wrong, you're saying there are no conditions that need to be met. It's unconditionally wrong. There are no conditions. It's always, always wrong. You see that? But if you say it's subjectively wrong, then you could be saying a number of things. You could be saying, me, I, John, find it wrong. And anytime I say it's wrong, I'm just reflecting my own subjectivity. Or you could be saying something like cultural relativism. You could be saying, in American culture, it's wrong to be polygamous. You know what I mean? That's another condition. You see that? It's not a subjectivity condition. It's more like a cultural condition. Do you guys see what I'm saying? Now, objectivity is ideal, right? Because if you want to say something is objectively wrong, you're saying there are no conditions attached to it. It's wrong because it's wrong because it's wrong, and it's not wrong only from one perspective or with certain conditions met. It's absolutely unconditionally wrong. You see that? Okay, I'm just really letting you see what's going on here, because we're using this word condition, and there's a burden here. What is a condition? That's so abstract that I don't even know how you would define that. And when we say something is a condition, are we basically saying that these conditions are members of some sort of concomitant? When we say two things are concomitant, it just means that one thing goes with the other. So technically, I think Hume would agree, whenever we burn something, there's things like fire and ash and smoke. Those things all go together. But to start talking about one thing being a condition of the other, or to start talking about one thing causing the other, we wouldn't entertain that. We would say that's a burden you can't meet. But you can't say they're concomitant. They attend one another. They're correlative. They're correlations, right? Are they members of some order in some series? When you say one thing is a condition of another, remember the argument for the existence of God, Aquinas? Remember those series we were talking about? We're talking about change in the world and how one thing influences another, like motion or something like that, or causation in the world. One cause leads to another, one event causes another, like that. That's what we mean by series or sequence, right? Now we're getting mathematical. When we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, right? That's a series. So one condition meets another condition, or meets another condition. What are you really looking at? I don't know. These are difficult topics. I don't think we've ever met this burden. My goal today is not to solve this burden at all. I don't think it can be solved, but I just want us to really, really feel the burden, like at a gut level, at a visceral level. Because what Hume did was revolutionary. So let's read this together. To say that a cause is a condition of an effect is to suggest or imply that the cause is a particular mode of being or condition of the effect. In other words, we're saying we cannot know the effect without this cause or condition. In other words, we cannot know the effect unconditionally. The effect is always in a certain condition, namely the condition of being conditioned by a cause. I know it sounds crazy, right? Yeah, but you're conditioned. To know something unconditionally is to know it without any condition. But if something is conditioned, it's like Pavlov's dog, right? You ring the bell and you give the food. After a while, he learns that. Every time he hears the bell, a certain condition is met in his mind, and he starts salivating. You know what I mean? So Hume is perfectly comfortable saying that kind of thing is going on. Hume would agree totally. We learn to associate different things. We learn it. But that's subjective. Do you see that? We do learn to associate different things. He's going to say we get into habits, customs. We subjectively learn that one thing goes with another. But from the fact that you need to make sense of the world by associating things, that doesn't give you the right to engage in metaphysics. What we should say is We are the kinds of creatures that get into certain intellectual habits to make sense of the world. He's fine with that. If you said that, he's okay. But if you say things like, I can actually either see or define or prove something like necessity, that's what he's going to say no. You've never seen necessity. You don't have an idea of necessity because necessity is a concept, it's not an idea. Do you guys see where he's coming from? Good. All right. To say that a cause is a condition of an effect is also to suggest or imply that there is an order in nature or a natural order of things, including patterns and laws of nature, such as causal laws and structures, which indicate universal, permanent, and possibly even objective orders and conditions in nature. And this, guys, is why I'm saying this is not just devastating for metaphysics or philosophy. Guess who else it's devastating for? Science. What are scientists doing? They're seeing one thing happen with another. They're associating them. They're learning subjectively, but they can't meet that burden any better than a philosopher can. You see what I'm saying, guys? They never saw necessity. They have never seen it. All they've ever seen is one thing go with another. They associate them, but that's a habit. That's an intellectual habit. So they have the burden too. Scientists have the burden too. Okay. But this concept of causality or causation is, of course, subject to empiricist scrutiny and objections of the problems of induction and necessary connection. Guys, remember we had two types of arguments, deduction and induction. Remember that? We talked about logic. Now, Hume is an expert logician. But he didn't write tons and tons of books about logic. He knew what he was doing. He didn't invent deductive logic. Euclid and people like that did that. And he didn't invent inductive logic either, because people like Francis Bacon were already doing enumerative induction. What he did, guys, is he said, look, technically, the kind of argument we're doing when we observe the world and we see two things linked and then we make that link watertight, what we're doing is a kind of reasoning. We're saying something like this. It's called the problem of induction. We're saying every single time this effect has occurred, this cause has accompanied it. But we're going from the fact that two things have gone together so long, and we're making the leap from the fact that they've gone together so long up until now, that they will forever go together. You see that? But we're not entitled to make that kind of claim. Why? Because there's an assumption there that's metaphysical. And it's something you could never observe and you could never prove. And it's not the assumption of necessity. It's another assumption. If you say, oh, from the dawn of history, the sun has always risen every day. And then you walk around saying, and therefore, the sun will always rise for all eternity. For Hume, you've induced the idea that it will always rise from the limited sample size you have in history. And for him, that's a logical leap. We're not dealing with the problem of necessity here. We're dealing with the problem of induction. There's a burden there. And what is the assumption you're making? The sun has always risen, according to all human records, right? Going back to the cavemen, the sun rose every day. But how does that justify you to say that it always will? And his answer, it doesn't justify it because you're making an assumption, something that you could never see or demonstrate. And what is that? It's the assumption that nature is always uniform or the same, right? But first of all, you've never seen nature. What in the world is that? And second, uniformity. Okay, even geographical uniformity is a huge burden. But let's put geographical aside. time has past, present, and future, right? So if you've seen in the past something happen, and you say it's going to happen in the future, you have a burden to meet. You're assuming that nature can't change. You're assuming that these laws you've observed in nature up till now are objective. They have no conditions. But what if there are conditions? What if all the laws we've seen right now are because of certain physical constants that are true for our world or our universe? What if there are parallel universes that have very different physical laws? What if they have a very different metaphysics? Do you guys see the burden? All right. I just want us to get through this language because not only is Hume a great thinker, but he's also a great writer. So we're going to see some of his language in a bit. But what I've written so far is just a real deep summary so that you can start to see what he's talking about. And then we're going to read some of him. And then we're going to conclude, guys. All right. And I hope you see why this is important for the free will problem, right? If you can't show causation, then if you're saying to have free will is to be able to affect your own actions, if you are the person, whatever a person is, we have no idea what that is. Let's say it's a substance. So if to have free will is to influence your own actions, you cause them to happen, not nature, not some laws, but you, then there's a burden. If you can't even show how causes cause effects, if there's a gap there and you can't show the necessity, we don't know what you're talking about, okay? When you say one thing determines another thing, we don't know what you're talking about. All right. And this in turn leads to the ultimate mystery of nature. So this is what Hume believes is our true epistemology reveals that nature is just a mystery. He believes that this in turn leads to the ultimate mystery of nature, which is why and how and why its powers, forces, and energies actually operate in nature, and how and why they perform or affect or achieve their effects from certain causes, and what exactly constitutes their causal efficacy and the propensity for a given cause to be in constant conjunction with a given effect. I need to demystify that a little bit. What he's saying, guys, is something like this. When I push this right here, when I push that, in our perceptions and in our common language, we tend to say, oh, he pushed it. But now, that's a very vague word. We have no idea what a push is. You guys see what I'm saying? When we get really technical, we might say, okay, one thing got in contact with another, right? But there's a huge, huge burden. The more precise we try to be, we're going to try and talk like Newton, right? Newton's going to talk about forces, energies, powers. And what Hume is saying is it doesn't matter how many equations Isaac Newton writes, the burden is not solved by making equations. Why not? Because when we talk about contact, guys, just like the mind-body problem of dualism, how does a mind influence a body? We saw that they were two different things, right? We couldn't understand how a ghost could push a chair. The ghost isn't in time and space. The very concept of contact doesn't make sense. But what Hume is saying, even if we lived in a completely material world and all physical effects were caused by physical causes, even then the burden couldn't be met. Why? Because when we have one material thing acting on another, interacting with another material thing, we have no idea of how that interaction could actually happen. Our idea of contact is very vague. Like zoom in on that thing we call contact. What's really going on? If one thing is moving another thing, in our common language, we're going to use vague words like force. But just like we don't understand how gravity works, we also don't understand how basic forces like friction or contact forces work. In other words, yes, we know that every time our hand gets close to this and we feel like we're pushing, we know that it moves. So again, one thing goes with another, we know that. But how does the force in my hand actually get the moving done? That's just as mysterious as our primitive forefathers who thought that, you know, every time there was, thunder, Zeus was angry. You know, I mean, we're at that level. We don't know what's going on. Nature is a mystery. And that's what I was telling you guys. Wonder, a sense of wonder and questioning things is far more precious than getting dogmatic and settling in your opinions. Feeling burdens is more noble than having convictions from a philosophical point of view. From a religious point of view, it's totally different. You guys hear what I'm saying? All right, let's finish. I really want you to hear Hume. All right. Okay, and this in turn leads to the ultimate mystery of nature, which is how and why its powers, forces, and energies actually operate in nature, and how and why they perform or affect or achieve their effects from certain causes, and what exactly constitutes their causal efficacy and the propensity for a given cause to be in constant conjunction with a given effect. And here's the killer, guys. We never perceive the necessity linking cause and effect in causal laws of nature, nor do we ever perceive the idea of efficacy, meaning the power, force, or energy that actually does the work and explains just how the cause causes and influences and affects the effect. So technically, causal laws are not physical laws, they're actually metaphysical laws. You see what I'm saying? They're metaphysical because they're mysterious. But to call them metaphysical in this context, where we have an epistemological burden, is not a good thing. Now we're saying bad. We have bad reasoning habits. We imply things where we can't prove the implication, right? For every cause, for every effect, we imply that there must have been a cause. But that's a rational intellectual habit that we're not justified in doing. So we are engaging in metaphysics all the time, but not in the good metaphysics of Leibniz, the bad metaphysics. We're just implying a whole bunch of stuff without feeling the burden of what we're implying. You see that? All right, I'll expose you to some Hume and then we'll be done. So Hume, in his book called The Inquiry, here's his language now. When we look about us towards external objects and consider the operation of causes, we are never able in a single instance to discover any power or necessary connection, any quality which binds the effect to the cause and renders the one an infallible consequence of the other. We only find that one does actually, in fact, follow the other. The impulse of one billiard ball is attended with the motion in the second. Now, this is the whole that appears to the outward sense. The mind feels no sentiment or inward impression from this succession of objects. Consequently, there is not, in any single particular instance of cause and effect, anything which can suggest the idea of power or necessary connection. So let's conclude, guys. He says, from the appearance of an object, we never can conjecture what effect will result from it. But were the power or energy of any cause discoverable by the mind, like as an idea, we could foresee the effect, even without experience, and might at first pronounce a certainty concerning it by mere dint of thought and reasoning. Guys, imagine God has created Adam, right? And Adam is in the garden, and he's looking at the apple. No amount of conceptual work. Let's say Adam has language and he knows what an apple is according to conventional use, conventional definition. No amount of reasoning is going to tell him what that apple tastes like. You see what I'm saying? That's the kind of thing you can only perceive. You got to taste the apple. So all this sophisticated technology we got from rationalism and from Socrates, it's good in helping us feel a burden, maybe, of how we don't even know basic things like definitions, but it's bogus technology. It only tells us trivial truths. On the other hand, and that's the bankruptcy of rationalism. The bankruptcy of empiricism is this: if this apple hits another object and causes it to move, all right? So I just used the word causes, right? So I've implied that there's some sort of connection between one and the other. This thing caused that thing. But what Hume is telling us is that is pure metaphysics. It's not physics. What you're saying is, I live in a world that I don't understand. Certain things go with others, and all I can do is describe it. So when I say one thing causes another thing, even though it implies that there's some necessity that I see, at a purely descriptive level, always is causal conjunction. One thing goes with the other. The motion of one occurs before the motion of the other. Guys, do you really see what I'm saying? All right, let's finish. So these are some examples. We talk all the time of crimes as effects of poverty as the cause. So we say poverty causes crime. Cause as an activity. And we say things like the impact of one pool ball colliding with another, the impact of the first ball causes the subsequent motion of the second ball. But technically that's bad metaphysics. We call it physics. We feel like we've got these departments of physics. We think we have everything figured out. But this burden has never been met by any scientist or philosopher, empiricist, rationalist, you name it. Bertrand Russell, writing the history of Western philosophy in 1945, right? The same year that the Second World War ends. He's writing, Hume created a level of doubt and skepticism that philosophers to this day are still trying to meet that burden, and no one has met it. And Bertrand Russell himself says, I don't think anyone ever will. But he's kind of like Kant. He's like, I wish I could figure this out because I want to rescue philosophy. I love philosophy, but it's bankrupt. So Kant is going to come in and try to rescue philosophy, but all he's going to do is say, look, what we're working with are certain intellectual habits that Hume discovered. What we call causation or causality is one more intellectual habit, and it's subjective. So the basic thing that Kant is going to do is he's going to clue it in to say, what we call the world is just the same way that Berkeley said or Leibniz. Idealism is very true. But Kant had a special type of idealism. He said, the world we see is structured by our mind. Just like the mind creates this narrative or story called causation to make sense of the world, that's generally what the mind does with everything. Colors, tastes, smells. The mind is hyperactive. So we got to remember what happened with Descartes, activity. The mind does activity rather than a thing. It's super exaggerated with Kant. Now the whole world is the creation of the mind, and it's the mind activity. And this means that what we see are nothing but appearances in our own mind. Space doesn't exist, time doesn't exist, causation doesn't exist. They're all conditions that we impose on the world, and we make the world intelligible using those things. The mind structures everything, and therefore this chair, we can never know what this chair is in itself. It's only a representation in my mind. My mind is actively making it in my mind. The only thing that Kant adds is that, Leibniz and Berkeley, they said that this is idealism. He adds a story about what your mind is doing. That's it. But the chair, the thing in itself, beyond the phenomenon, called that the noumena, the world as it is itself, that external world that Descartes was trying to figure out, that's forever unknown. It's the type of thing we can never know. And it's a burden we can never meet. So guys, that's it. Let's take attendance.